Thank you, Elena from Belize, for that video, which is taking us very nicely into our next panel discussion, where we're going to be looking at the challenges facing us as we use technology in our schools. So there is no doubt, there is no question that teachers need resources and training, both of which have been sadly lacking as we moved to distance learning. The platform has been quite uneven. But more than that, educators and schools should not be simply test subjects for random software and hardware use. We should be in the forefront, I believe, of designing the application of ICT in education. And we're going to have a discussion for just about 15 minutes on this. And to drive this subject, I'm joined by Maddie Fennell, Executive Director of the Nebraska State Education Association and a board member of EdTech Evidence Exchange, Daniel Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers and Vice President of AFT, and Michael Soskil, a Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year and author of Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy. Thank you so much for joining me, panelists. Dan, I'm putting you on the spot right away. Let's get this discussion going. What does it take to make distance learning work and make technology a part of real professional practice?
Well, I'm going to start with, and thank you, Nadine, I appreciate being here. I'm going to start with two things I think that we're experiencing right now globally. I can tell you we're experiencing it here in Illinois, where I've been a teacher and our union president. And the first is, the digital divide, which tracks totally along wealth. So you can look at communities around the United States of America, and this is true globally as well, and you see wealthy communities have connection, have resources. The students have connection and resources. So we can't really offer a fair and free, generous public education to all students if they don't have the ability to log on, to have devices. And we're just seeing that kind of blow up in our faces right now, and it's a crisis. The second part of it is attached to that, and that is what are teachers actually doing right now when they're teaching remotely? Where I am, most teachers are teaching remotely right now. Some are kind of hybrid, but we haven't had the training and the time. But most importantly, a majority of teachers are not being consulted in what is it going to look like. And we need to have the teacher voice, the union voice front and center to determine what schooling is going to look like right now.
With you on that one, I don't know if anyone from the panel would want to jump in with a quick comment here before I ask us to share on another question. Of course, bearing in mind that we are 15 minutes, we're down to 15 minutes now.
Sure, Nadine, I'll jump in, and again, thank you for having us. Just to add to what Dan said, I think it's really important to understand that districts that are doing this well and schools that are getting this right during the pandemic are the ones that are reaching into their teaching force to ask, how can we be successful? Teachers know the resources in the community, they know their students better than anyone else, and they know how those two things intersect with the pedagogy that we need to make sure our students are successful. And so when teachers are involved in those discussions and how to design a digital learning experience for students, they end up being way more successful.
Okay, so that takes me to the next question, and Maddie, you're up next. Who should really and what should really be influencing the decision-making process in selecting education technology? When I think of the world that we will have 15 years from now, when I think of the industry that my students will move to, what really should be those things that are influencing the decisions?
Well, what really needs to influence how districts choose their technology from both their educators and the end users, which are the students. And too often what we've seen is the decisions on both the hardware and the software for technology are actually coming from those who are farthest away from the classroom, whether it be an administrator who's attended a conference, but that administrator is either at a district level, perhaps at a school level. One of the things that the EdTech Genome Project is trying to do is get more, what we're trying to develop basically is a consumer's digest for school hardware and software so that we can have teacher-to-teacher input around what really works in a classroom and what are the circumstances that make that work. Because even if you buy a great program, if you're not implementing it with fidelity, or if you buy good hardware, but you're not putting it in the right way, you're going to have problems with that. So we're trying to set up not only the right purchase, but installation, whether that be hardware or software, in the correct way. And that's best done when you have the voice of educators at the table.
Any follow-on comments here? Any follow-on comments? I think my mic wasn't unmuted yet. Daniel, I see you nodding.
Just to follow up on what Maddie said, I mean, we completely agree. I think what we've seen in the COVID context since, say, March, and even over the summer and into the fall here, is that, you know, a lot of districts are kind of plowing ahead. We've seen a lot of districts purchase new learning management systems and spend a lot of money. There's kind of a famous case in Miami-Dade, the fourth largest school district in the United States, where they had a $15 million plus no bid contract, and they had to pull that back because it was a disaster. But, you know, down into a lot of, you know, just much smaller and more typical school districts for us, there's a kind of a rush to say, let's get the tech going. And you know, rather than pulling back and starting, as Maddie said, start with the teachers, you know, how are they thinking about how they're going to teach third grade math and what technology is going to support that, et cetera.
Okay, so moving along, any more comments on that one? I sometimes wonder what is the philosophical position that really drives some of what we encounter. Why is it we're not collaborating? Why is it that we're not approximating, you know, in terms of, and I see, Michael, you're nodding, and I know you're raring to go.
I am. I love this question because I think too many times we don't start where we should when we're having these discussions. And that's really, what is the purpose of education? If we don't get that question right, then we get everything else wrong. And Diane Ravitch had a great quote in one of the previous segments where she said, democracy can't survive without an educated populace. And there's a big difference between being educated and being learned. And right now we're having a lot of conversations about how do we get kids to learn in a remote setting. But we're not having conversations about how do we make sure that they're fully educated in a remote setting? How do we make sure that their social and emotional health is protected? How do we make sure that our practices are trauma informed when our students are going through incredible trauma at home and can't be with their teachers in school? How are we making sure that they're holistically well and they understand their self and how that self fits into the greater society? And I think there is no one better in the system able to have those conversations and drive that forward than our teachers. And that's why it's so important that we reach into that teaching force and make sure that they are starting with that philosophical question and then driving it through everything else that happens in the system, whether or not we're in a pandemic or in a more regular school kind of setting.
And Nadine, can I just jump in? I just want to add to what he said, what Michael said, is that part of the problem that we're having is we're trying to apply old solutions to a new problem none of us have ever seen before. And if we do not have every stakeholder at the table as we look for those new solutions, we're going to fall into an implementation gap. We always talk about the achievement gap for students, but we really need to be talking about the implementation gap for adults. And that's the gap that occurs between your good ideas and when the rubber hits the road, actually when it hits the classroom, because you haven't had the people at the table that actually have to implement your great ideas. And since none of us have ever been through this before, we really need more than ever to have everybody at the table. You know, everybody thought it'd be great. We're dealing with a lot of districts where I'm at, where they thought it'd be really easy to just have teachers teach synchronously or high flex so that the kids in front of you are getting it the same as the kids on the computer. And that actually does not work well. But they didn't ask any teachers about it. And so it's that implementation gap we have to talk about.
So what do we say to our policymakers? What do we say to our government? What do we say to our ministers of education?
Well, I think we start by saying, if you want to avoid unintended consequences, talk to the people who understand where policy and practice meet. Talk to your teachers. Make sure that they are not just at the table, but that their narrative and their expertise is driving the decisions that you're making that influence our students.
And we actually did that in Nebraska. We pulled together a teacher advisory committee, and after meeting with them, our commissioner put out new regulations that added additional teacher plan time because he could see the stress that teachers were under trying to teach synchronously.
You know, Maddie, I had a conversation recently with a colleague of mine, And one of the things that he said to me is that as unions, right now we have to spend more time embracing the one leg over another in a sense. We have to look more at our professional development, advocacy in that area, even more, even though I know industrial relations issues are going to emerge in a little while. But for this, our purposes here, we need to really spend time dovetailing into professional development. What are some of the ideas we can give our unions to go about advocacy in this context?
Nadine, this is Dan. I'll comment on that one sec, but I want to go back to something Maddie just said.
Okay.
Well, it's actually your question, Nadine, about, what do we tell our governments? And I think, the context, as Mike said, we have to think about the context of the whole child. And right now in the United States and many other countries, the child in that context is in a very precarious state in terms of healthcare, in terms of safety, because they're at home and maybe not in public schools, in terms of food security, and in terms of the effect on children of being in front of a computer. And not having that social interaction, not having that teacher who's going to hug that crying child or whatever, or just be able to have those discussions with kids at the high school level. So I think we need resources. I think part of our commitment or part of our job here is to really turn that lens back to our communities, back to our parents, back to our political leaders to say, we can't do this, just as we can't do it with the same teaching methods, we can't do it with the same resources. We need more resources. And then that also plugs into your question about professional development.
Yeah, so Nadine, if I can just build on that and tie it to what you had asked about union structure. I think what all three of us are saying is that we need a flattened hierarchy. Instead of things being coercive and top-down in our education system, we need them to be grassroots, and we need teacher expertise to be driving the conversations. I think the same is true in our unions. We want our unions to be have a flattened hierarchy and to be driven by the needs of teachers on the ground. And so the more our unions can reach into that membership and provide them what they need to be successful in their classroom, the more it opens up the capacity to have conversations that benefit not just the union and not just the teacher, but also the education system as a whole, as those unions go forth to advocate what we know our children need in schools.
I was going to say, and as a union leader, it's a very careful balance for us because we were trying to provide a lot of professional development online for our teachers around the newest tech and around trauma and we were over extending our teachers because by the end of the day, they were tired of being on technology. So it's a careful balance for us as to offering enough so it meets the needs, but not so much that we add to the stress level of teachers.
Well, I think I completely agree and go back to kind of the beginning of the conversation where a lot of districts or state agencies have like plowed money and let's just buy some new technology as if that's going to help you, right? Like that's the solution if only you have that. So it really kind of goes back to that fundamental of listening to the educators and what do we need.
We need to understand that the technology is not a panacea. It's just another tool that we're going to use to deliver. Now we are running out of time. And the conversation was really getting started, but I know we're going to continue the conversation afterwards. I have a question, which probably could be seen as a kind of an ethical question in a sense, when you think of us moving from the 4th Industrial Revolution and there's talk of the 5th Industrial Revolution. Maddie, the lady on the panel, the woman on the panel, let me ask you to start. How do we ensure that as we implement all of this technology that we can be so impersonal, how do we ensure that we maintain that touch that we have been known for as teachers, time immemorial?
We have to stay rooted in that old saying, students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And education is based on the relationship between the student and the teacher. And as long as we always keep that at our center, we'll know to strike that right balance between in-person and utilizing technology to meet the need of every learner.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I agree with Maddie. I think we need to make sure, of course, that our schools are technologically relevant and that they reflect the world outside of school. So there has to be technology involved in what we do pedagogically and what our students are using. But at the same time, we need to make sure that education is rooted in the things that are most important, that it's always been rooted in: humanity, empathy, compassion, all of those things that we want to see reflected in a democratic society. And the people in the system who are best at that are our teachers. Our teachers are, no one has the capacity to love more than our teachers do. So we need to lean into that and make sure that our teachers have the capacity to lead.
Short and spicy, this discussion has been. We are catching up, we're making up on time. And so we are going to our closing now. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this panel. It has been insightful, and I'm sure the conversation will continue some more. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Nadine.